They tied her at dusk, just as the sun bled red across the dry hills of Hollowridge. Not with cruelty, no, they claimed it was a lesson in decency. The ropes were loose, as if kindness were being offered in the softness of their knots. But shame doesn't need to be tight to hold. It only needs an audience. Clara June Whitlow stood barefoot in the churned mud outside the chapel fence, her dress heavy with dust and heat. Her arms, thick and freckled, were looped behind the rail like some passive warning to the other women. A wooden placard had been hammered into the earth beside her: refused marriage, rejected God's will. Children watched her from behind their mothers' skirts. Men smoked and turned away. Women leaned close to each other, whispering in pursed tones. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Agatha Coyle, stood nearest the door, her bonnet casting sharp shadows over judgmental eyes. She should have been grateful, Agatha murmured. Jed Sallow isn't handsome, but he's a provider. Clara said nothing. Her mouth was dry as sand, her throat swollen from the unspoken. The ache wasn't in her wrists or shoulders but in the silence that followed her refusal. A week ago, she had told Jed no. That simple, trembling word had been enough to paint her as an offense. She thought of her mother's grave out past the orchard. She thought of the boots she wore the day she dared to paint wildflowers on the barn wall. They'd mocked her for that too. Somewhere, a cow bellowed in the distance. A dog barked at a tumbleweed caught in the wind. And still, no one moved to untie her. Not until Elias Creed rode into town. He came with the dust, quiet and lean, the kind of man whose grief was carved into his face like age. His coat hung loose over broad shoulders, and his boots hit the ground soft as mercy when he dismounted. People parted when they saw him. Not from fear, but the way you'd shift to let a funeral pass by. He didn't speak at first. Just looked at Clara. Their eyes met, his pale and steady, hers red-rimmed and swollen from holding back too much. He looked at her the way no one had that day. Not with pity. Not even with surprise. Just recognition. Like he saw something in her that no one else had bothered to find. "What's this?" he asked the mayor, who scratched his gut beneath a vest too fine for his office. She refused Jed. The town agreed. She shamed herself and needs correcting. Elias looked to the placard. Read the words once. Then again. His fingers flexed around the brim of his hat. "No law says she can be tied like this," he said. "It ain't law. It's tradition," the preacher said. "Then it needs breakin'. There was no shout, no declaration. Just that single, low-spoken sentence. But it was enough. Elias walked to Clara. She did not flinch as he reached behind her, undid the ropes gently, let them fall into the mud. He shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. "I don't need saving," she whispered. "Didn't come to save you. Just didn't think you ought to stay cold." She didn't thank him. And he didn't ask her to. The mayor sputtered. "You claimin' her?" Elias turned. "I'm talkin' her home. She stays there as long as she chooses." More whispers. More stares. Clara, for a moment, hesitated. Then she stepped forward. Bare feet in the mud. Coat too long for her arms. No dignity left but the strength in her spine. Elias's horse stood still as he lifted her onto the saddle. He climbed up behind her, arms light around her sides, as if holding a secret instead of a woman. They rode through town under the wide, watching eyes of those who'd tied her there. The clouds rolled thick and low. Thunder grumbled somewhere westward. And not one person stopped them. Not one offered her a blanket. Not one asked her forgiveness. When the first raindrop hit the brim of Elias's hat, Clara breathed in deeply. The air smelled of wet soil and wood smoke. She didn't speak the whole way. Nor did he. The silence between them was not hollow, but full, like a room left just for thinking. Elias's homestead was small, nestled near a rise of hills and a thin, slow creek. The porch sagged a little where time had worn down its beams, and the rocking chair out front moved with the wind, like someone still sat there. Inside, the fire was already lit. The smell of cedar smoke met them first. He handed her a towel, said nothing, then placed a pot of stew on the stove. Clara sat stiff-backed at the table, still wearing his coat. "I don't want to be owned," she said. "You're not," he replied. "Stay or go. You'll do it as yourself." She nodded. Slowly. Her hands were still red from the ropes, but she made no move to hide them. The meal passed quiet. He ate without looking at her much. She barely touched the stew. Afterward, Elias stepped outside to split wood. Clara found the basin near the hearth and began to wash her feet, the mud curling away from her skin like a second shame peeling off. She caught her reflection in the dark window. Hair matted. Eyes puffy. But beneath the weariness, a flicker of something untouched. She remembered the day she painted on the barn. Bright yellows. Sloppy purples. It made her laugh, even when the neighbors said it was childish. That memory lit up in her chest like a tiny lantern. Outside, she heard the axe strike wood, steady, metronomic. Not angry. Just necessary. She dried her feet, folded the towel, and found an old quilt tucked behind a chair. It smelled faintly of lavender and dust. She didn't ask whose it had been. Elias returned after dark. She was asleep in the corner, head against the wall. He watched for a moment, then turned the lamp low. In sleep, her face had softened. The weight of the town had not vanished, but in the warmth of that room, it no longer seemed to crush her. Elias sat down in the rocking chair beside the door. It creaked with each slow sway. In the dark, with only wind and firelight to keep them company, neither of them said a word. But something began then. Not a romance. Not yet. But a flicker. A recognition. Two lives, broken differently, placed beside one another. Like two mismatched fence posts holding up the same wire. And though morning would bring gossip and judgment and all the noise the world insists upon, tonight there was stillness. Tonight, there was the sound of a woman breathing free. Morning came slow, like it wasn't sure it belonged there. Clara woke with the quilt tucked up to her chin and a mug of lukewarm coffee on the table beside her. Elias was already outside, his boots crunching softly against frost-crusted grass. The quiet of the house was different now, not lonely, but expectant, like it had begun to remember what it meant to be lived in. She stood barefoot on the wooden floor, the chill biting her toes, and walked to the window. He was splitting logs again, steady and unhurried, the rhythm of it like breath. Every movement he made had the weight of someone who didn't rush pain or pleasure, who had lived long enough to know both would come whether invited or not. Back in town, her name was already on every tongue. "They say he's gone soft," muttered Mrs. Agatha Coyle as she handed out him sheets at Sunday service. "Took her in like a stray." "Maybe she put something in his stew," someone else added. Children repeated the words without knowing their meaning, and men laughed at the idea of Elias Creed, stoic, grief-worn Elias, sharing a roof with the woman they'd all deemed unworthy. But none of it reached the cabin. Not really. Not in the way it was meant to. Clara started small. She swept the front porch until the wind cleared more than her broom. She dusted shelves that had long forgotten touch. In the evenings, she boiled water for tea and left a second mug beside Elias's without being asked. He never commented on it, but the next morning, she'd find both cups washed. They didn't talk about the town. Not yet. And certainly not about Jed Sallow. Instead, they spoke in gestures. She mended the rip in the curtain without fanfare. He hammered in the loose porch board she'd tripped on once, quietly fixing what might wound her again. She drew small flowers in chalk on the barn wall, and he never wiped them off. One day, as she scrubbed the hearth, Clara found a basket of yarn tucked behind a crate. Colors her mother would have called cheerful, blues like dusk and oranges like firelight. She picked up a needle and began to weave without knowing what she'd make, only that her hands needed to move. That afternoon, Elias came in with a cut across his palm, shallow but bleeding. Without a word, she pulled him to the basin, cleaned it with a gentleness he hadn't felt in years. "You don't flinch," he said. "Too many people already do." He nodded once, as though that explained something he'd been wondering about. The next day, she woke to the scent of baking. Elias had made cornbread, burnt around the edges but warm in the middle. He left it on the table without a note. Weeks passed like that. Quietly, steadily. A rhythm, unspoken but shared. They moved through the house like two ghosts learning how to live again. But the outside world had teeth. Jed Sallow returned the way storms do, loud, unwanted, and sure of his right to ruin. He rode in just before dusk, the sky painted in sickly gold. His horse kicked dust at the porch, and his boots hit the ground with the confidence of a man who'd never heard no and believed he never would again. Clara was feeding chickens when he arrived. She froze when she saw him, the old fear rising up, sharp and ugly. "You think hiding behind that man makes you safe?" Jed sneered. Elias stepped out of the barn, hands loose at his sides. "She's not hiding," he said. "She's living." Jed spat in the dirt. "I paid for her dress. I made my offer fair. She owes me." Elias didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "She's not a debt." Clara stepped forward, chin lifted despite the tremble in her hands. "I'm not yours," she said. "Not then. Not now. Not ever." Jed moved, fast and reckless, grabbing her wrist, but she didn't shrink. And Elias, with no anger on his face, took Jed by the collar and walked him backward off the porch. "Leave while you still got teeth." Jed looked at Clara, disgust and disbelief twisting his mouth, then turned and mounted his horse. "This ain't over," he said, and galloped off like a man afraid of staying still. After he was gone, Clara sat on the edge of the porch, her breath shallow but steady. Elias didn't speak. He just stood there, watching the spot where Jed had vanished. "I thought I'd be afraid forever," she whispered. "You weren't today." That night, she didn't sleep in the corner. She made her bed on the cot by the window. The moonlight spilled across her quilt, and the sounds of the house creaked around her like old lullabies. In the morning, she found a pair of boots at the foot of her bed. Sturdy, beautiful things, clearly chosen with care. Tucked inside was a folded slip of paper. For when you're ready to walk beside me, not behind. Clara didn't cry. She didn't gasp or cover her mouth in surprise. She simply ran her fingers along the worn leather, then stood. She stepped into them, and they fit like a promise. When she opened the door, Elias was on the porch, 2 mugs of coffee steaming in the chill. He didn't speak, didn't look up right away. She sat beside him. Their shoulders brushed just barely. The prairie spread out before them, golden and alive, and the wind sang through the grass like some old hymn no one had words for anymore. Elias handed her a mug. She took it without hesitation. And somewhere behind them, the rocking chair creaked again, no longer haunted, but held. People still whispered. They always would. But Clara had found something louder than their words, a place where she wasn't owed, or claimed, or corrected. She was chosen. Not because she was small or meek or quiet, but because she stood, once tied to a fence, now rooted in a life she dared to grow. And if you find yourself broken by the hands that said they loved you, if they tie your worth to the way you bend, or shrink, or obey, remember Clara June Whitlow. She didn't run. She rose. And she built something soft, and real, and wide enough for both her shadow and her light.